The hall was packed. The music is loud, the lights twinkling between crystal glasses, laughter and conversations permeating the stuffy air of the party. I should have told you I was coming, but I wanted to surprise you. After weeks of exhausting work, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to see her smile, relax, as she enjoyed the evening. However, as I approached the entrance, something inside me began to stir. A restlessness that seemed to prepare me for what was to come. It wasn't the surprise I had planned, but something that would change my life forever. I walked through the crowd, greeting familiar faces but keeping my eyes fixed on her, who was on the other side of the room. I saw her before she even noticed my presence. She looked beautiful, as always. But I wasn't alone. There was something about the way he touched her, a subtle intimacy, almost imperceptible to others but clear to me. My breathing stopped for a second. I stood still, just watching, as the world around me seemed to freeze. He held her arm, too close, smiling in a way I had never seen before. There was no room for doubt. That closeness was not innocent. She turned, and our eyes met. Her smile disappeared instantly, replaced by barely concealed panic. I walked towards them, slowly, each step echoing inside me like a pounding hammer. When I got close enough to smell the perfume she wore, the same one I had chosen for her last birthday, I couldn't contain the sharp tone in my voice. "What's going on here?" I asked, knowing that my question was rhetorical, but hoping, perhaps, for a miraculous excuse that would erase that scene. She stammered, tried to take my hand, but I backed away, looking at them both with a mixture of disgust and despair. He tried to intervene, saying something about misunderstandings, but I cut him off with a look that made his blood run cold. There were no more misunderstandings there. The betrayal was explicit, naked and raw, evident in the way she avoided my eyes, in his defensive posture. All the love and trust one had built up for years seemed to evaporate in a matter of seconds. "We need to talk," she murmured, desperate. I laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, full of disbelief. How can anyone talk after destroying everything? There weren't enough words in the world to justify that. I turned my back, but she followed me, gripping my arm tightly, asking, begging for a chance to explain. At that moment, I felt the weight of humiliation crush me, the curious gazes of the people around me piercing my skin like blades. "Explain what?" "That I'm not enough for you." My voice was louder than I expected, attracting even more attention. "Or that this is my fault. Because honestly, I don't want to hear anything else from you." The silence around us was unsettling. I pulled away again, but not before staring at her lover for a few more seconds, etching his face into my memory, promising myself that he too would face the consequences. The pain was unbearable, a mixture of anger and sadness that consumed me from the inside. But in that moment, it wasn't just about what she had done. It was about what it meant for me, for us, for everything we had built together. I left the party, but the scene stayed with me. The image of her and him together, the way she seemed comfortable until she was caught, the pathetic attempts to justify the unjustifiable. I knew that night was the end of something I believed was indestructible. But it was also the beginning of something new, something I couldn't predict but which promised to be as devastating as it was eye-opening. However, there was something she didn't know. Something that would make those excuses useless and their explanations even more empty. I knew more than she realized. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me, but the reason behind it. I was about to discover how far lies could go and, more importantly, how far I was willing to go to settle the score. Now, sitting in the silence of my car, reliving every detail of that night, a question echoed in my mind: what makes someone cheat? Would it be selfishness, neediness, or something deeper, darker? I knew that finding the answer wouldn't change what happened, but maybe, just maybe, it would help me understand how I got there. Or maybe not. Maybe it was just the beginning of an even darker spiral. I started the car and started driving, with no clear destination, just trying to escape the whirlwind that had become my mind. But as the city's lights blurred past, one thing was certain: this betrayal had consequences. Not just for me, but for everyone involved. And I was determined to make sure no one came out of this unscathed. Welcome to our channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry an important truth: betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust, and leaves deep scars. Our goal is to show how these choices can have devastating consequences. Get ready now to dive into a shocking story, full of twists and intense emotions. Take a deep breath, because what you are about to hear will stir your feelings. Good story. Ethan and Clara's marriage was, to all outside eyes, a solid, almost exemplary union. They had met at the end of college, at one of those parties where no one expects to find anything meaningful. Clara, with her light smile and eyes that seemed to capture every detail around her, caught Ethan's attention before he even had the courage to say something. He was her opposite in many ways, reserved and methodical, a man of few words, but with a look that brimmed with intensity. Maybe that was what brought them together. Clara saw in Ethan the stability she always sought, while he found in her the spark that was missing in his life. After 2 years of dating, they got married in a simple but meaningful ceremony. From the beginning, Ethan made a point of showing that he was willing to build a future with Clara. He worked long hours at a consulting firm, quickly rising through the ranks thanks to his dedication and ability to solve complex problems. Clara, on the other hand, had the soul of an artist. After leaving behind an administrative job that didn't make her happy, she dedicated herself to opening her own gallery. The small space she rented was a haven, filled with vibrant canvases, intriguing sculptures, and a touch of organized chaos that reflected her own personality. The balance they had found seemed unshakable. Clara knew that Ethan's late nights at the office were part of his effort to provide them with comfort and security. Ethan, in turn, admired Clara's passion for art, even if he didn't always understand the world she created in her paintings. It was as if everyone had found a comfortable space to coexist, where differences were not barriers, but complementary pieces of a larger puzzle. Still, there were moments of tension. Ethan, with his practical personality, often had difficulty expressing his emotions openly, while Clara longed for spontaneous displays of affection and words that confirmed that their love was still as strong as it was in the beginning. They didn't fight often, but the prolonged silences after small disagreements carried a weight that was hard to ignore. There was a sense that they were both avoiding confronting something larger, a void that, although unnamed, seemed to lurk in the distance. Things began to change when Ethan received a promotion that brought even more responsibilities. Now, their work nights stretched into the early hours of the morning, and weekends that were once reserved for impromptu getaways or long lazy breakfasts had turned into meetings and last-minute calls. Clara supported Ethan's success, but couldn't help feeling a growing sense of loneliness. He spent more time at the gallery, finding solace in the company of other artists and the visitors who enjoyed his exhibitions. One of these visitors was a collector who began coming to the gallery regularly. At first, Clara saw him as just an interested client, someone fascinated by the art she presented. He was charming, articulate, and knew how to give compliments without sounding superficial. The conversations between them, which began with analyses of colors and textures, soon evolved into more personal exchanges. Clara, without realizing it, began to open up, sharing parts of her life that she didn't even discuss with Ethan. For her, there was nothing wrong with those interactions. They were just a relief from the days that were becoming increasingly empty. Ethan, although overwhelmed, began to notice subtle changes in Clara. His behavior seemed less predictable. She was more distant some nights, and on others she was surprisingly cheerful, as if she were carrying a secret. He tried to ignore the doubts that arose, convincing himself that they were just reflections of his own guilt for not being as present. Instead of asking directly, Ethan preferred to observe, looking for answers in gestures and words that often didn't come. At that time, the couple also faced pressure from friends and family about an issue they both avoided: children. While Ethan believed it was only a matter of time before they were ready, Clara wasn't so sure. She never verbalized her fears, but the idea of losing the freedom she cherished, or repeating patterns she saw in her own family, scared her more than she cared to admit. This silent impasse was another brick in the invisible wall that was beginning to rise between them. The upcoming wedding anniversary felt like an opportunity to reconnect. Ethan planned a trip for the two of them, something he hoped would rekindle the flame that seemed to be fading. Clara was grateful for the effort, but there was something in her expression that made him uneasy, as if she were only physically present while his mind wandered elsewhere. During the trip, Ethan tried to ignore the discomfort, focusing on the landscapes and the moments of tranquility they managed to create. Clara, in turn, tried to convince herself that it was just a phase, that the love she felt for Ethan would be enough to overcome whatever was troubling her. Back in their routine, the distance between them became even more evident. Ethan, consumed by work, began seeking answers to the questions that haunted him in conversations with a close friend, someone he trusted deeply. The words he heard only intensified his doubts. What if he was neglecting Clara to the point of losing her? What if it was already too late? Meanwhile, Clara sank deeper and deeper into a sea of conflicting emotions. There were times when she felt guilty, like she was betraying Ethan just by thinking too much about someone else. But there were also moments of anger, when she believed he was responsible for leaving her so alone, so adrift. She never verbalized these feelings, perhaps out of fear that putting them into words would make them too real. The arrival of a corporate party organized by Ethan's company was the catalyst for the upcoming events. Clara, initially hesitant, ended up agreeing to go. It was the kind of occasion that used to be pleasant, a chance to escape the monotony and be with him in a less formal setting. Ethan, on the other hand, saw the party as more of an obligation, something that needed to be done to keep up appearances and strengthen professional connections. That night, as they both got ready, there was a palpable tension in the air. Clara seemed distracted, as if she were dealing with something she couldn't share. Ethan, watching her silently, felt a knot in his stomach, but said nothing. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't know how to approach the issue without causing a confrontation he might not be prepared to face. They left the house together, but when they arrived at the party, the feeling of being worlds apart became even clearer. Ethan was immediately engulfed in a series of conversations with colleagues and superiors, while Clara wandered around the room, lost in thoughts and looks that she didn't know how to interpret. That night would be the starting point for something that neither of them could predict, but whose consequences would change their lives forever. The party was in full swing. Laughter erupted throughout the room, punctuated by the sounds of glasses clinking and lively conversations. Ethan circulated among the guests, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries and fulfilling his role with the same dedication with which he conducted everything in his life. His presence was requested everywhere, but he felt something was missing. He looked around the room, trying to find Clara, but she was out of sight. A strange feeling began to settle in, a mixture of restlessness and discomfort that he couldn't explain. Clara, in turn, had moved away from the main crowd, seeking refuge in a more private corner of the room. She felt out of place, as if she were only there in body, while her mind wandered into confusing territories. He held a glass of wine with trembling fingers, observing Ethan's interactions from afar. He was surrounded by people, always with that confident look that had attracted her so much in the past. But now, she felt as if there was an abyss between them, something that words couldn't bridge. In the middle of her contemplation, a familiar voice brought her out of her thoughts. He was the gallery's collector, the man who always seemed to appear at moments when she most needed distraction. He approached her with a casual smile, asking if he could join her. Clara hesitated, but nodded. There was nothing wrong with talking, she told herself, trying to ignore the slight shiver she felt when he got closer than necessary. The conversation flowed naturally, as it always did between them. He praised her new exhibition, talked about how her works had a unique impact, and mentioned how she seemed different that night, more serious, perhaps. Clara laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension that was beginning to build. She felt torn, as if each word exchanged was a step further from Ethan and closer to something she didn't know whether she wanted or feared. Meanwhile, Ethan finally found a moment of respite and decided to look for Clara. He passed through the main hall, looking between the groups of guests, but she wasn't there. He roamed other environments, feeling the discomfort build in waves. A series of scenarios began to form in his mind, each more disturbing than the last. Deep down, he knew something was wrong, but he fought the idea, trying to rationalize her behavior as simple tiredness or annoyance. Clara and the collector, on the other hand, had left the main party. He suggested a quieter place, away from the hustle and bustle, where they could talk better. Clara hesitated again, but followed him. They climbed a side staircase that led to a dimly lit terrace. The cool night air seemed to ease some of the tension, but not enough to lift the weight that was accumulating on his shoulders. He began to speak in a more personal way, revealing details of his life, his frustrations, his desires. Clara listened to him, but her responses were hesitant, as if a part of her knew she was crossing an invisible boundary. Ethan, still searching, went up the same stairs by chance. The sound of voices coming from the terrace attracted his attention. He recognized Clara's voice immediately and stopped at the bottom step, hesitating for a moment before continuing. What he saw made his heart stop. Clara was next to the man, laughing at something he had said, but there was something more. The way she tilted her head, the sparkle in her eyes, the way he lightly touched her arm. It wasn't just a conversation. It was something more intimate, more meaningful than Ethan was prepared to face. Ethan remained still for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, trying to process what he was seeing. The feeling of betrayal began to seep like poison through his veins. He couldn't clearly hear what they were saying, but it wasn't necessary. The expressions, the gestures, everything indicated that there was something she hadn't shared with him, something that was beyond the surface of their recent estrangement. He gripped the stair railing tightly, trying to contain the explosion of emotions that threatened to consume him. On the terrace, Clara began to realize the gravity of the moment. The man approached a little closer, their eyes met, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. It was as if that moment represented a choice, a fork in the path she had followed for so long. But before any words could be said, the sound of firm footsteps interrupted whatever was going to happen. Ethan entered the terrace, his presence filling the space with palpable tension. Clara instinctively took a step back, while the collector straightened up, trying to maintain his composure. Ethan's eyes fixed on the two of them, switching between Clara and the man, as a cold anger formed in his expression. There was no need to say anything. The silence that followed was more devastating than any immediate confrontation could be. Clara tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. She knew there was no justification, no explanation that could erase the image Ethan had just witnessed. The collector, realizing the gravity of the situation, took a step back, muttering something about leaving to make room. But before he could walk away, Ethan stared at him with an intensity that made him hesitate. It was as if a silent duel was taking place, a battle of wills in which no one emerged victorious. When they were finally alone, Clara tried to approach Ethan, but he backed away, raising a hand to stop her. His eyes were filled with pain and disbelief, as if he was trying to understand how they had gotten to this point. Clara, in turn, felt torn apart, consumed by guilt and fear of what would come next. She opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off, his voice low but firm. "Not here. Not now." Ethan turned and left the terrace, leaving Clara alone, with the words stuck in her throat and the unbearable weight of what had just happened hanging in the air. The impact of the moment seemed to reverberate in every corner of empty space, and she knew that nothing would be the same. Ethan stayed up all night, sitting in the living room with the lights off. The images of what he had witnessed on the party's terrace replayed in his mind like an endless movie. The betrayal was evident, even if no words were spoken. The weight of the silence between him and Clara, who had returned to the apartment hours later, was suffocating. She didn't try to speak, she just passed by him like a shadow, carrying with her the guilt and uncertainty of what was to come. Ethan, however, knew that the night couldn't end there. He needed answers. As the sun began to rise above the horizon, the sound of the coffee maker interrupted the silence. Clara was in the kitchen, moving her spoon almost mechanically, as if she wanted to find refuge in a banal routine. Ethan stood up slowly, feeling tired from a night of turbulent thoughts. He entered the kitchen, and the tension in the air seemed tangible. She stopped what she was doing when she noticed his presence, but didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the cup in front of her. "There's no point trying to avoid it, Clara." Ethan's voice was calm, but carried with a firmness that made her shudder. "We need to talk. Now." Clara took a deep breath, as if gathering all the courage she had, and finally looked up at him. Her gaze was filled with remorse, but also with something more, something Ethan couldn't quite identify. She nodded, pulling out a chair to sit on, while he did the same, positioning himself in front of her, with his arms crossed and his gaze fixed on her. "I know what you saw," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I know there are no excuses for that." "So tell me," Ethan interrupted, his patience running thin. "What's going on, Clara? Who is he? And why did you think you could do this to me, to us?" She looked down, as if the words she needed to say were too heavy a burden to carry. For a few seconds, the only thing that could be heard was the distant sound of morning traffic. Ethan didn't look away, waiting for her to finally speak. When Clara looked up again, there were tears in them. "I never planned for this to happen, Ethan. Never. He appeared at a time when I felt alone, invisible. You were so busy, so distant. I know it's not your fault, but I got lost." "Did you get lost?" The disbelief in his voice was palpable. "And you decided that the best way to meet was with another man?" Clara wiped her tears quickly, as if she wanted to pull herself together before he saw her completely broken. But Ethan's words were like blows, and she knew she deserved every one of them. "I was wrong, yes. And I wanted to stop. I wanted to tell you everything before it was too late. But there's something else, Ethan, something you need to know. Something I didn't have the courage to say before." He frowned, confused. The betrayal wasn't enough, now there was more. What could be so serious that she was hesitant to reveal it? "So say it, Clara. Get it over with already." She took a deep breath, finding the strength to face the truth she had hidden for so long. "He didn't appear in my life by chance. He came after me because there was something he wanted, something that involved you." Ethan's heart raced, and his mind began working quickly, trying to connect the dots. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "What are you saying, Clara? Was he using you? For what?" She hesitated again, but knew she could no longer run away. "He's someone you know, Ethan. Someone who was rejected by you in the past, someone who holds a grudge and who saw in me an opportunity to get to you. He wanted information, he wanted to sabotage you." The revelation hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. Clara's words floated through his mind as he tried to absorb what he had just heard. "Who is he?" His voice came out as a dangerous whisper. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. They both looked at each other in confusion before Ethan stood up and walked to the door. When he opened it, his face immediately hardened. There he was, the man he had seen on the terrace. The same casual smile, but now with an air of defiance that made Ethan's blood boil. "Good morning," said the man, ignoring the tense atmosphere. "I think we have some things to discuss." Ethan didn't respond, just stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Clara stood up immediately, nervousness written across every line of her face. The man approached her, but Ethan blocked the way, standing between the two. "If you have something to say, tell me." Ethan's voice was low, but filled with contained anger that could explode at any moment. The man smiled again, as if he was enjoying the situation. He took something out of his pocket, an envelope, and placed it on the table. That should clear everything up. Ethan cautiously took the envelope, opened it, and began reading. As his eyes ran over the words, his face changed. The initial shock gave way to an expression of pure hatred. He threw the papers on the table and faced the man. "Did you use my wife for this? To try to destroy everything I built?" The man shrugged, without losing his smile. "Business, Ethan. You know how it is. I just took advantage of an opportunity." Ethan took a step forward, but Clara grabbed his arm, begging him not to do anything impulsive. "Get out of here now," Ethan said through gritted teeth, his voice full of venom. The man obeyed, but not before taking one last look at Clara, who looked away, embarrassed. When the door closed, the silence returned, but now it was filled with tension. Ethan turned to Clara, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and anger. "Did you know that all along? Did you know he was trying to get to me?" Clara shook her head, desperate. "I didn't know at first, I swear. But when I found out, I was already too involved. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you would hate me. And now you think I don't hate you?" Ethan shouted, unable to contain the explosion. Clara started crying again, but he didn't care anymore. The secret was out, and with it, the foundations of their marriage had crumbled. Ethan turned and walked out the door, leaving Clara alone with her guilt and the wreckage of what was once a life together. Ethan left the apartment with quick steps, almost running over his own thoughts. Anger burned in his mind, mixed with the crushing pain of betrayal and the revelation that Clara had become a pawn in a dirty plot he could barely understand. The cold morning air hit his face, but it wasn't enough to clear the confusion in his head. He needed answers, but most of all, he needed distance. "I couldn't stay another second in that place, surrounded by the memories of a love that now seemed so fragile, so corroded." He took the car and drove aimlessly, the sound of the engine filling the silence he didn't want to face. The streets were still relatively calm, as if the world was unaware of the storm raging within it. After a while, he parked in front of a park that he used to frequent in his moments of reflection. Sitting on one of the benches, he looked at the horizon as he tried to organize the pieces of his life that seemed to have scattered like broken glass. Hours passed until the phone began to vibrate incessantly in my pocket. Clara. He didn't want to talk to her, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. He let the device ring until it stopped, but the silence was short-lived. Then a message came. Reluctantly, he opened it and saw a single sentence: "We need to finish this conversation, please." Ethan snorted, almost laughing at the irony. She wanted to end the conversation, but he felt like she was already done with much more than that. When he returned to the apartment, the silence between them was deafening. Clara was sitting on the sofa, her eyes swollen and red, as if she had spent the entire time crying. Ethan remained standing, hands in his pockets, staring at her with a mixture of coldness and disdain. She tried to speak, but he raised his hand, cutting her off before she could begin. "You have 5 minutes to say what you think still needs to be said. After that, I don't want to hear anything else." Clara swallowed hard, trying to gather the necessary courage. "I knew that every word would be judged, analyzed, and that any mistake could be definitive. I never wanted this to happen, Ethan. Never. But I felt lost." He showed up and seemed to understand what I was feeling, seemed to know exactly how to fill in the gaps that I couldn't explain to you. And by the time I realized what he really wanted, it was too late. Ethan crossed his arms, his face expressionless. "So you decided to betray our marriage. You decided to expose me, to let a stranger use you to get at me. Was that it?" Clara shook her head quickly, tears streaming down her face again. "I know I made a mistake. I know I failed you, but I didn't know how to get out of this. He manipulated me, Ethan. He used my insecurities, my weaknesses. But I never wanted to hurt you. You never wanted to hurt me." Ethan laughed, but it was a bitter, humorless laugh. And what do you think this all did to me? What do you think it was? A little discomfort. A temporary inconvenience. She tried to respond, but the words seemed to choke her. He approached, pointing at her with an intensity that made her flinch. You didn't just destroy what we had. You exposed me. You put our life, our marriage, my career, everything at risk. Why? Why was I lost? Why did I need attention? Ethan took a deep breath, trying to control his voice, but the tone was still sharp. You should have come to me. You should have said something, anything. But instead, you chose him. Clara sobbed, unable to contain the pain that spilled into his every word. I didn't choose him. I chose error. I chose poorly, Ethan, and I know it. But you have to believe that I never wanted that to happen, ever. Ethan was silent for a moment, as if her words were finally breaking through the barrier of anger he had erected. But the pain was still deep, and the trust they had built felt distant, almost unattainable. And now? He asked, his voice lower, but still full of bitterness. What do you expect me to do? That I just forget all this? That I can move on as if nothing had happened? Clara shook her head again, not knowing how to respond. I don't know, Ethan. I just know that I love you. Despite everything, I love you. And I would do anything to make it right. He laughed again, but this time he sounded more tired than angry. Love is not enough, Clara. Not after that. Silence once again filled the space between them. Clara wanted to get closer, touch his hand, but she didn't know if he would allow it. And Ethan, as much as he wanted to believe her, couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that seemed to permeate every part of his being. Finally, he sighed and turned away, walking towards the door. I need some time. I need to think. Clara tried to stop him, but he left before she could say anything. The tears fell freely as she fell onto the couch, hugging herself as if that were enough to hold the pieces of a life that seemed to fall apart. Ethan, on the other hand, drove aimlessly again, trying to find some clarity amidst the chaos in his mind. Hours later, he stopped in front of a hotel. I needed space, distance, a place where I could breathe without the constant weight of Clara's presence. But deep down, I knew that space wouldn't solve everything. There were wounds that would need much more than time to heal. Ethan remained in the hotel room for days, immersed in a silence that was only interrupted by the sound of the television, used more to fill the void than out of real interest. He had isolated himself from the world, unable to face the questions he knew would come from friends and colleagues. The initial anger had dissipated, but in its place was an overwhelming sadness, a sense of loss that seemed to eat away at every part of his soul. He wondered if he would have the strength to rebuild anything, be it his life, his career, or even the trust that Clara had destroyed. Clara, on the other hand, was fighting her own storm. Ethan's absence from home was a constant reminder of his choices and the consequences that had followed. Every corner of the apartment seemed filled with memories, from the happy moments they shared to the more recent ones filled with tension and distance. She spent her days turning over her thoughts, trying to find a way to repair the irreparable, but each attempt seemed to bring her back to the same point, the recognition that she had crossed a line from which she might never return. One night, Ethan decided to go outside for some fresh air. He walked along quiet streets, where streetlights cast soft shadows on the ground. He had no destiny, just the desire to escape, however briefly, the weight of his own emotions. It was then that he found himself in front of a small, almost empty bar. He entered without thinking much, sitting at the counter and ordering a drink. The bartender, a friendly-looking middle-aged man, served the order and began a casual conversation. Ethan, initially reluctant, eventually relented and shared part of his story, omitting names and specific details. The man listened silently, occasionally nodding or offering a word of empathy. When Ethan finished, the bartender sighed, wiping a glass with a worn cloth. You know, guys like you always come around here. They think they are the only ones carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, but the truth is that we all have our scars. The question is, what are you going to do with yours? The simplicity of the question caught Ethan by surprise. He had no answer. I didn't know what I would do or even what I could do. I just knew that continuing in that limbo was unsustainable. Meanwhile, Clara decided to act. I could no longer bear the inertia, the waiting for Ethan's return or for a decision that might never come. He picked up the phone and scheduled a meeting with a couples therapist, even though he didn't know if Ethan would agree to participate. She knew she needed to try, needed to show him that she was willing to do whatever it took to rebuild what they had lost, even if it meant facing her own flaws and insecurities. The next morning, Ethan received a message from Clara. She didn't beg, she didn't make empty promises. It was a simple invitation: I have a session with a therapist. I'd like you to come, but I understand if you don't want to. He stared at his cell phone screen for long minutes, undecided. Part of him wanted to ignore the message, but another part, perhaps the more rational one, knew that avoiding Clara forever was not a solution. Hours later, Ethan found himself in a small office, sitting in an uncomfortable armchair, with Clara at his side and a therapist watching them with a calm, attentive gaze. The beginning of the session was tense, full of long silences and short answers. Clara tried to express her regret and explain how she had gotten to that point, but Ethan remained distant, his arms crossed and his face rigid. I don't know if this can be fixed, he finally said, his voice full of pain. I don't know if I can look at her and not see what happened, not feel this betrayal. The therapist, without flinching, leaned slightly forward. No one can guarantee this will be fixed, Ethan. But what we can do here is create space for both of us to understand what really happened, so that we can decide, clearly, what to do about it. Clara, with tears in her eyes, looked at Ethan, looking for some sign that he was willing to try. But he didn't return the look, remaining focused on a distant point in the room. In the days that followed, Ethan delved into memories of his relationship with Clara. He relived the early years, full of passion and enthusiasm, but he also revisited the most difficult moments, the periods when both seemed to be on opposite paths. He realized that Clara's betrayal was a symptom of something bigger, a void that had been growing between them for a long time, but that didn't make the pain any less intense. It didn't erase the fact that she had chosen someone else instead of looking for him. Clara, in turn, dedicated herself to confronting her own weaknesses. She began attending therapy sessions alone when Ethan didn't show up and began writing letters to him, letters that might never be sent, but that helped her organize her thoughts and emotions. She knew that rebuilding her marriage, if it were possible, would require more than words. It would require real changes, both from her and from him. Ethan eventually started responding to Clara's messages. His answers were short and cautious, but they no longer carried the initial coldness. He didn't know if he was ready to forgive her, but he was beginning to recognize that holding a grudge was as exhausting as the betrayal itself. He needed time, but more than that, he needed clarity. One cold afternoon, Ethan received one of Clara's letters. She had left it at the hotel lobby, inside a simple envelope. He opened it hesitantly, reading each word carefully. The letter was not a request for forgiveness or an attempt to justify his actions. It was an honest, raw account of how she had lost herself, how she had allowed her insecurities to lead her to make decisions that destroyed what she valued most. She didn't ask him to take her back, but expressed her desire to be better, for herself and, perhaps, for him. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. He felt something shift inside him, something that wasn't exactly forgiveness, but an opening to consider that the love they shared, despite being hurt, could still have value. He knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe there was a chance. Not to forget, but to rebuild, piece by piece, something that could be called the future. Months had passed since the last time Ethan and Clara had shared the same space for more than a few minutes. Attempts at couples therapy were abandoned, replaced by a silence that spoke more than any session could have done. They had both chosen to go their separate ways, but what it meant to move forward was different for each person. Ethan, determined to rebuild his life, focused on work and rediscovering who he was outside of his role as a betrayed husband. Clara, on the other hand, immersed herself in a process of self-discovery, trying to understand how she had allowed her own insecurities to lead her to the point of losing everything. Ethan finally found himself at a point where Clara's memories no longer dominated his every thought. He had moved into a new home, a simpler, more functional space that reflected his new approach to life. He maintained sporadic contact with friends and colleagues, but avoided in-depth conversations about the past. One night, while reviewing documents for a new project, he received an unexpected message. It was Clara's. Not a long letter, not a request for reconciliation, but just one sentence: "I hope you are well. Thank you for everything I learned from you." Ethan read the message several times before deleting it. He didn't respond, but he felt something inside him quieten. It wasn't complete forgiveness, but perhaps a step toward it. He knew he needed to leave the past behind, not to forget, but to move forward authentically. He started frequenting local cafes, spaces where he could interact casually without the weight of expectations. It was in one of these places that he met Sarah, a woman with a light spirit and easy conversation. The interactions began unpretentiously, but over time, something deeper began to form. She was different from Clara in many ways, but what caught Ethan's attention most was the simplicity and honesty she brought with her. Meanwhile, Clara found a new purpose in art. Her gallery, which once felt like an extension of her insecurities, has become a space for genuine expression. She began creating pieces that reflected her internal journey, exploring themes of loss, redemption and self-discovery. These works attracted attention, not just from critics, but from people who saw themselves represented in the vulnerability she exposed. Clara also began to get involved in community projects, teaching art to young people in difficult situations. "I felt like I was finally contributing in a meaningful way, something that previously seemed unattainable." The man who had been the catalyst for all the destruction did not emerge unscathed either. His actions, motivated by revenge and selfishness, came back to haunt him. His involvement with Clara and the scheme against Ethan were exposed, destroying his professional and personal reputation. He lost the job and connections he valued so much, and was forced to face the consequences of his choices in isolation. With no one to blame but himself, he was forced to face the true extent of the damage he had caused. Months later, Ethan and Clara met by chance at an art exhibition. It was an unexpected moment, but not as uncomfortable as Ethan had feared. Clara was accompanied by a group of young artists, passionately explaining their works, while Ethan, there only as a visitor, watched from afar. In a moment, their eyes met, and she smiled. Not a smile of hope or longing, but a smile of gratitude. He reciprocated, feeling for the first time that he had closed that chapter. Later that same day, Ethan met Sarah for dinner. As they talked about future plans and laughed over trivial stories, he realized that although the scars from the past were still there, they no longer defined who he was. He had found something new, something worth building, and that was enough. Clara, in turn, returned home that night with a similar feeling. She hadn't gotten back the love she lost, but she had found something more valuable, a version of herself that was honest, resilient, and willing to grow. She knew her path would still be full of challenges, but she also knew she was better equipped to face them than she had ever been before. This story shows that betrayal destroys, but also teaches. It teaches about choices, about consequences and, above all, about the power of starting over. Comment what you thought of this story and which part caught your attention the most. Subscribe to the channel to follow more intense narratives like this. And remember, our channel does not support any type of betrayal. Here, we show how these choices can impact lives in profound and lasting ways. Until the next story.